I would like to talk about what I call, there are two things that affect identity when it comes to Judaism. One, of course, is the relationship to Judaism. And obviously there are denominations that we give appellations, we give connotations to different denominations, and it also means the way certain Jews see Judaism, right? And then, of course, the second thing is culture, which also connects to geography, but mostly to culture. Because if you're living in a certain culture, it's going to affect you. There are many examples that I could give for something like this. Even Jewish laws affected by culture. I'll give you an example. According to the Bible, polygamy is allowed. Polygamy, having many wives. However, de facto, when you look, even take our patriarchs, Abraham, he only had one wife. Sarah requested that he marry Hagar, right? He wasn't interested. Isaac had only one wife. Jacob only wanted one wife, but Laban tricked him. They got the wrong one. But he didn't divorce her. He took the next one too, right? So, which was considered an idea of support in antiquity. But even if you go further on to the time of the Talmud, when we look in the Talmud, we don't find any rabbinic figures that had two wives. Both in the Mishnah and in the Gemara, which means both in Palestine until the year 200, and both in Babylonia, we only find the rabbis that their wives are mentioned, there's only one. So that means that even though polygamy was allowed, it was frowned upon. Doesn't mean it wasn't allowed, it was frowned upon. But if we go later on into Jewish history, we find that the Jews who lived in Arab countries, Muslim countries, where it was very accepted to have a different, more than one wife, you had Jews who had more than one wife. You had in Morocco, you had in, I'm not sure about Spain, but you definitely had in Morocco, you had in Iraq, you had in, I mean, there were places where you had Algeria. I have a friend whose older brother was born in Algeria. Hello, welcome. He's also from Algeria. The family's from Algeria. And his brother, when he got married, in the what they call the ketubah, the marriage certificate, or it's sort of like an agreement. So it says, which is very interesting, it says he's allowed to take his second wife if the first wife agrees. Okay? So this was the way of Jews living in these countries, creating a sort of synthesis between what they thought was the culture, accepted culture of that country, and the way they should act. In other words, they're not going to take a wife just like that, a second one just like that, unless the first one agrees. So he never did, but I'm just saying it was an interesting thing. In the Ashkenazic countries, meaning, let's say, European countries in general, especially, let's say, Middle to Eastern Europe, because in Spain, of course, you didn't have Jews in Spain for 500 years. In the year approximately, let's see, it was exactly 1,000 years ago from about 1980. So about the year 970. There was a rabbi whose name was Rabbeinu Gershom. He was called Rabbeinu Gershom, the rabbi of all the diaspora. And he lived in Ashkenaz, which means the areas of Franco-Germany. And he basically created an edict, a rabbinic edict, that no man is to marry a second wife. That even though the Torah permits polygamy, we don't. This was accepted unanimously in all the Ashkenazi communities. But the fact that it was accepted on all the Ashkenazi communities has no bearing on Jews in other communities. I'm just talking about giving just one example, how sometimes cultural issues can have an effect even on the understanding of halakha. Meaning everybody knows that in halakha, in Jewish law, polygamy is allowed according to the Torah. The only question is whether this is the ideal. You know, something can be allowed, but maybe it's not the ideal. So in Ashkenazic countries, they were very tough about it. In other countries, outside of, let's say, Christian Europe, they were much more tolerant because they didn't see any reason not to. So that's just an example. There are other examples too. Another example of Passover. There's an argument in the Talmud whether on Passover, you're not allowed to eat leavened bread. Leavened bread means things that are made out of the 5 grains, which is wheat. How do you say that? Gru, barley. Okay, no, gru I knew. Barley. Okay. No, barley is what they make beer out of. Like when you make beer. Yeah, and then you have avena, oats. No, orez is rice.
No, orez is not the same. Orez is rice indeed.
Yes.
Orez is barley. Orez is, I don't know, sorghum.
Yeah, it's like when you put in the soup.
Yeah.
Yeah, barley, right. So you have gru and then barley, oats, right? Aven, right? And then you have rye, which is another type of grain, and spelt. I don't know how to say spelt. Yeah. So out of those 5 grains, when you make, that's how you can make bread. By the way, only bread which is made out of those 5 grains does it have the blessing, which is called hamotzi lechem min haaretz. The blessing for bread. Like if you eat bread which is made out of corn, it's not even the same blessing.
Can you repeat all 5?
Okay, so we said wheat, barley, oats, rye, spelt. There's actually a question about spelt, whether spelt actually existed in biblical times. Is a historical question, but de facto, we consider it also one of the 5. Now, concerning Passover, just like if you leaven bread made out of those 5 grains, if you don't leaven the bread out of those 5 grains, then it's called matzah. As we say in French, le pain azim, right? Matzah, which is unleavened bread. So unleavened bread, matzah, also has to be made out of one of the 5 grains. Either wheat or barley or oats or rye or yes, out of one of those 5. Now there's an interesting question in the Talmud. What about orez, rice, and millet? I don't know how to say millet in Romanian. I can check millet. I'll tell you in a moment. My translator. Millet. It is mei, M-E-I. Mei. Oh, shalom.
How many of you?
And Avram from the pizza is coming soon. I think everybody will be able to take one home. Wait. Okay, we should come a little bit closer, maybe. We'll have to try again tomorrow.
Yes. Okay, this is what.
Did that work?
Yes.
Okay. You can take a picture of online. There are more people here.
Can you take a screenshot?
A screenshot?
Yes. No, a screenshot.
Oh, I don't know how. You know how to do a screenshot? Okay. Okay, so what was my example? So there's an argument in the Talmud. What about orez and millet, mei? Because it also ferments. So maybe it should be considered something which is like unleavened bread because it's very similar, even though you don't make bread out of it. Some people do. Some people make bread out of rice. So this is an argument in the Talmud. Now, interestingly enough, all the Ashkenazic and what we call poskim, those who decide Jewish law, they all decided that rice and millet is not allowed on Passover. In all the countries where Jews ate a lot of rice, like in Yemen, like in Iraq, like in Iran, where all they eat is rice every meal, right? They didn't see the point because from their point of view, if you're not eating bread, what else are you going to eat if you don't eat rice? So we can't. If it's an argument, we have to go to the leniency. So today in Israel too. So many of the Jews from the Arab countries, they will eat rice on Passover. None of the Ashkenazic Jews eat rice on Passover. So I'm just saying how sometimes cultural things can affect even your decision whether there's a controversy in which direction to go. So that was just a point of view from halakha, but there are other things too. How do we identify ourselves sometimes? Let's say, I know specifically in Jewish life, you see this a lot, that people, when they grow up, even if they're not so religious, they identify their Judaism with the food that they remember as children. So an Ashkenazic person will remember gefilte fish. You know what gefilte fish is? It's usually made out of krap. In the United States, they make it also with whitefish. In Israel, it's with
something.
sometimes it's stuffed, sometimes just like balls, fish balls. So you know how, they say, how do you catch a gefilte fish? You take a jar, you put it in the water, and it jumps into the jar, like forms in a round thing. So that's a joke. But anyhow, so like Ashkenazim will talk about gefilte fish. They will talk about, we have a lot of things in Yiddish, like you have kreplach and knedlach, and they put in soup, but a lot of things with the lach. And whereas if you take Jews from other countries, they identify totally different things. And that's the way, those are the smells that they remember from the holidays. Those are the things that they remember from the holidays. And you have different Jewish communities remember things very differently. For one, Passover is one thing. For another one, it's another thing, because everybody remembers the food from their mother's house, right? So I'm just saying that even things like this can be very different. Synagogues look different in different countries, just by the style. By the way, if you walk in, let's say into Synagogue Mare, where they have a little bit of a museum, and even the Coral Temple, it's like Moorish style. That's just with the architecture at that time was influenced Moorish style, not necessarily. I mean, if it was Constanza, it would make more sense. But I'm just saying all over the country, you have this Moorish style for synagogues that were built in the second half of the 19th century and the early 20th century. It was a style. You can find the same thing, for instance, in Vilnius. Also, the synagogue is in Moorish style. So it's an architecture sometimes where people live. So the architecture of the synagogues that are built in Christian countries are usually Christian architects, so they look more like cathedrals. Mm-hmm. But if you see the architecture of synagogues that are in Arab countries, so the architecture will be a little bit more plain. Interestingly enough, though, when they moved to Israel, the synagogues in Israel are very much more lavish than the one that you find in other places. If you go to Safed, where there are a lot of what we call Sephardic style synagogues, when you walk in, there's something very plain about them. You have something in the middle, a canopy over the bima, where they read the Torah. You'll have the Torah scrolls on the front, usually something that looks like it in the back too, where they just keep books. They'll have two. The women will be on the top normally, whereas in Ashkenazic synagogues sometimes they're on the bottom, and sometimes they're in a balcony in the back. But I'm just saying the different styles will be influenced both by the architecture and the way they see these things in these communities. Okay, so as I said, you have local custom which will influence. It won't stand against the halacha, but it'll influence the halacha. And sometimes you remember the local custom more than you remember the other things, because these are things that affect communities. So identities have two things. They have number one is the relationship to Judaism. Am I close to it? Am I less close to it? What does it mean to me? And the second thing is going to be, as I said, cultural differences where Jews live. This eventually, when we get to the state of Israel, we get to that discussion, the same thing, it's the same thing in the state of Israel. I'll give you an example. And this is an underlining issue for a lot of issues today in the state of Israel, what I call a philosophic underlining issue that nobody talks about. You know, politics is a symptom. It's not an actual reason for things. My father used to always say there's a difference between, in life, there are two things. You have the urgent and you have the important. How do you translate that?
Urgent and important.
Yes. Politics is about the urgent. But life has things that are important. Now, things that are urgent, you have to deal with now. But in the long run, once you solve them, it's the important things you want to deal with. For the individual, the urgent is, I need food, I need clothing, I need a job, I need a place to live. Once I've solved that, that's solved. The important is never solved because it's ongoing. I want to develop myself as a good human being. I don't want to make sure that those in my family develop as good human beings. That's a lifetime investment, you know. And I want to educate myself. I want the people around me to, you know. So, I mean, the things that are important are ongoing. So in politics, they talk about things that are important, but they don't, it's not that important for them. What's important for them is what we call the urgent. Okay? In the state of Israel today, by the way, and I'm going forward, even though I'll go back to the backwards again, there are two elements which also affect the identity of every Israeli. Now I'm jumping from Jew to Israeli, and that is the relationship between how you understand the state of Israel. Now, everybody agrees in Israel that Israel is a Jewish and a democratic state, but that means different things for different people. For instance, let's take the first one. What is a Jewish state? Is it a state comprised of Jewish people, or is it a Jewish state? That's not the same thing. Early Zionism, Herzlian Zionism, in the Basel Conference of 1897 in Switzerland. So the idea was we need a state of Israel, because we need Israel, they didn't call it the state at the time, even though Alt-Neuland mentions it in the second book, it talks about the state of Israel. But the idea was that we need a shelter for Jews against anti-Semitism. Okay, so a shelter for Jews, that means a state of Jews. That could be in Bribijan, where the Russians wanted to make it. Could be in Argentina, where Baron de Hirsch bought lands for Jews in the 19th century. That could be in Uganda, where the British, you know, had an idea of putting us there. Not sure if that would have worked. You know, you can always see when Jews live in the exile and the diaspora for 2,000 years, you can see how impractical they become. The very fact that a lot of people thought that was a good idea to have a temporary country in Uganda that would eventually move to Israel. I mean, that doesn't even make sense. How do you move a country? But for them, it did because they never had a country. You know, so people who are not living in your own country makes you very impractical when it comes to politics. So, but eventually that didn't happen, which is a good thing. It would have been a major disaster. So I said, this means things for different people. So we talked about Jewish. For a person who is traditional or religious, a Jewish state means a state, for instance, that the businesses are closed on the Sabbath. For somebody who's not religious, it doesn't really matter to them that much. They'll say, but why can't we have these buses? Why the bus drivers are not allowed to rest on the Saturday? It's like, think of it from their point of view, not necessarily from your point of view. So, and it's other things too. It's like, in what sense, let's say, should Jewish law influence the legal system? De facto, there is no influence at all on Jewish law in Israel's legal system. There was one Supreme Court judge whose name was Menachem Elon, passed away about 20 years ago, and he entered into Israeli law that if there's an issue where British and Turkish law do not cover, because Israeli law is based on British and Turkish law, then you're allowed to use Jewish law to solve the problem when there's no precedent for it. He was the only one who used that clause, though nobody else on the Supreme Court did so. So he was the one who did that. But there is marriage and divorce is under rabbinic law. The reason why marriage and divorce in Israel, by the way, is under rabbinic law is because it was such under the British. When the British were in charge in Palestine, so all the various religious denominations had their own religious courts for marriage and divorce. So when the state was started in 1948, they just continued what was called the status quo. It's a term that they even use today, meaning under the British, if you wanted to get married, if you were Jewish, you went to a Jewish court. If you were Muslim, you went to a Muslim court. If you were Christian, you went to a Christian court. And that's the way it was done. And that's the way it's done today in Israel too. If you don't want it that way, you can get married in Cyprus and come back.
There's no constitution in Israel.
There's no constitution. There never was.
And there will never be, or
in my humble opinion, after this, what we call balagan takes place in Israel, I think there might be. My guess will be that Israel will do the same thing Germany did in 1946. They took all their basic laws and turned it into constitution. I'm guessing that's what's going to happen in Israel. Yeah.
Who's going to vote for it?
What do you mean?
Who's going to approve that constitution?
Well, it'll be the members of the Knesset, most probably. The vote already happened, but as you can see, you can vote for something and people can still make balagan. And the majority of the people voted for something, but there are people. I'll try to explain that, but not now. It's a little bit more complicated. You have to understand different elements that exist in Israeli society to understand how that can happen. And also that it's not as bad as it looks, because Israelis are very, they like to voice their opinion. You know, there was a story one time when Golda Meir had a meeting with Richard Nixon so that must be right before the Yom Kippur War. And Golda Meir said something, and Nixon said to her, Mrs. Meir, you have to understand, you're talking to a man who's the president of a country with 250 million people. So Golda Meir said, excuse me, Mr. Nixon, but I am the prime minister of a country with 2 million prime ministers. There is something to that, okay? People see their concept of freedom as extending very far in Israel. Possibly because everybody in the country went to the army. So they sort of feel like, you owe it to me, sort of like certain people, let's put it that way. Okay, let's get back to this. So just like there's a concept of what it means to be Jewish, is it just a country of Jews, or is there supposed to be some content here, which affects a lot of things? The school system. Should Judaism be taught in the schools? Many people think no. Other people say, how can you not? Okay. So what happens in the religious schools, of course, it's taught. In the general schools, it depends on the school how much. They'll give a class in Bible. But in the very secular schools, they'll teach Bible according to Bible criticism. So it's not even Bible in the end. If for Bible to be Bible, it has to inspire. There's nothing about the critical method that is inspiring. You understand? So I'm just saying that it's like you have two parallel lines going on at the same time. And because of that, it creates a slight chasm, because then people understand things different ways. If you went to school and you studied Bible and it was just about the critical theory, as a child, you'd walk out of there and you say, there was nothing to learn from that. But if you had a good Bible teacher who made you enthusiastic, your whole life you'd want to study that. Yeah, that's just it. And it would change everything you thought about God, religion, everything. Because of that one teacher who showed you that there's another way to look at a text. So that's a problem. Even the question of democracy. So he said Jewish and democracy. What is democracy? Is it an ideal? Or is democracy a necessity? Those in Israel who are less connected to the Jewish part of the state, but they accept the fact that it's a Jewish country, for them, democracy has become a sort of like ideal to fill a void. Because they feel like, oh, those guys who are more religious, they don't really believe in it. So, but we do, right? It's not, whether it's true or not, you could argue at that point. But I'm just saying, okay? So there was a professor at the Hebrew University. His name was Yeshayahu Leibovich. He was well known because even though he had 5 doctorates in the sciences, he used to talk a lot about Judaism. And he was actually more well known because what he used to say about Judaism, because he liked getting people angry. I don't think he did it on purpose, but that was just the way. He likes saying things that would challenge people. So one time said, Professor Leibovich, what is your opinion of democracy as an ideal? So he said, it's not an ideal. It's a necessity, like going to the bathroom. You can't live without it. Okay. So that's a different way of looking at things, okay? But the point is, so those who see democracy as a necessity, meaning there's no other way to run a society, and then there's Judaism as the other element, then there's a constant balance between the two. They don't see the problem between having a Jewish state and democratic state. But those who think that democracy is a whole set of ideals instead of Judaism, they don't want the Jewish part because they're afraid it will take over democracy. What's going on now in Israel is more fear than real. There's actually 3 different types of people who are in these demonstrations. Type number 1 are the ones that it's not even about the judicial reform, they just don't like the government. They're the ones who started, by the way. It has nothing to do with the issue. If it's this issue today, tomorrow will be another issue, okay? They want their people back in the government and they don't care if the house burns down. Okay, so that's part 1. They're a very small group, but they're extremely vocal and very well funded. Because unfortunately, there are a lot of European countries who have all these NGOs who like funding them. That's the hard line. Then you have a second group. And the second group is the people who ideologically are against it, but also that's the guy with the pizzas. Hello? Hi, Abraham. Ken, what entrance, what street is this? Strada. Abraham is upstairs with the pizzas. You know, Abraham? Do you know Felicia? She's gonna meet you outside.
Okay, I know it's Strada Corte, no? Which Strada?
זה שם אדגר קינא.
אתגר קינא. זה נקרא אתגר קינא. It's where the plaza, there's a little plaza, יש כמו רחבה כזאת, ויש כניסה, זה בצד ימין של הבניין, ויש כמו רחבה כזאת. יש פונטונה, נכון? יש גם מזרקה שם.
אפשר לשלוח לו...
Oh, they're going to send you a location.
Okay, so this Robert. Thank you very much.
To do with my phone?
לפתוח את הוואטסאפ.
Oh, I don't know his WhatsApp.
זה אותו מספר.
Yeah, but I don't know if it shows it.
או הפלאפון.
Here's Abraham Restaurant. It should be here, right? I don't see the WhatsApp. I don't know how to do that. Oh, you got it. Oh, very good. Okay, sorry about that. So as I said, there are three groups. There's the hardliners who are really politicians. They're not in the government, but they're politically minded NGOs who have a very specific agenda. Then you have just people ideologically who are against because they want something different. And then you have a lot of people who don't understand the issue. And so there's a lot of propaganda, so they're nervous. Yeah. These people, as soon as the government gets together, and I'm assuming this is going to happen with the opposition, and they come to a compromise, the vast majority will just go. Because then they'll realize it wasn't what they thought.
Yes.
What? Okay. So I just wanted to mention that. I have friends who are part of that third group, the ones who are just afraid. So I talk to them sometimes. I try not to talk too much about politics in Israel because I believe that as a teacher, I want to be neutral as possible. So that's important to me. Because as I said, for me, the important is more important than the urgent. There are other people who can deal with politics, but you need people who are going to deal with the important all the time. That's why I try to keep away, or I'm just very diplomatic about things.
The teacher was not supposed to speak about politics.
Oh, there are a lot of teachers who speak about politics.
No, but before in history.
In history, no, not necessarily. In Israel, most professors talk about politics. I never do. So, they have nothing better to do, so they do that. Yeah. So, yeah.
It's important also for the teachers to have a point of view.
Everybody has a point of view, but the question is, what is your goal in the end? You see, I'll give you an example. I teach conversion in Israel. Oh, there he is again. Hello? Ken, מצאת?
לא שלחת לי.
Okay. He says he didn't get it. ken, שלחתי לוואטסאפ.
הוואטסאפ הזה?
זה לא אותו מספר, היה מספר אברהם מסעדה.
שלחתי לוואטסאפ של אברהם מסעדה. מסעדה.
זה ממש פה באוניברסיטה, זה ממש על הכיסא.
Does anybody know what he looks like, Avram? No?
תבוא לי את הכיסא ואני אגיע.
Okay, okay, let's take maybe a 2-minute break. I just have to bring this fellow here, okay? 2 minutes, I'm very sorry.
No ways on his.
It's important to do something that you say. Yes.
Necessity.
Well, it's only a necessity when you're in every. Okay, dear friends, so let me so all this discussion really was to say that there are two aspects that influence identity, as I said before. One is your relationship, Jewish identity. One is relationship to Judaism. And again, when we talk about Israel, we'll see that even in the Orthodox community, there are a lot of relationships to Judaism. It's not just denominations of Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionists, religious, not religious. And of course, the cultural influences, which will also have an influence, especially when you're living among those cultures. Because when you're living among cultures, they have an influence by osmosis. You don't even realize the influence. It happens and you think that it's not there. The most insular Jewish groups, if you take a group in Williamsburg and Brooklyn, Hasidim from I don't know, Hungary. And they think that they're so insular that they're not affected at all by the outside world. It's not true. Because they don't even realize how affected they are. Because when you live in society, that society affects you. But there's nothing you can do to get around that. You can minimize it, but you cannot get around it. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit about denominations. The interesting thing in Judaism, when we talk about denominations, you can't talk about the ones that are still around, but historically, we'll see that the denominations that did exist disappeared, which didn't necessarily disappeared, vanished.
Can you explain a little?
Yeah, I will.
Notion of denomination, because for me.
But what a denomination is? No. Denomination, you have Orthodox Christians, you have Catholic Christians, you have Protestant Christians, you have Baptists, I don't know, they're like a lot, evangelical, I mean, there are like a lot of them in Christianity. I think there are really a lot of denominations. In Judaism today, there are denominations, not as many, which were influenced since the emancipation, since the beginning of the 19th century. Before that, there also were in antiquity, but the ones that existed in antiquity disappeared. So I have here a list, the thing that I sent you. You can look at it. A moment, let me just open it up. Where is it again? Here, identities and groups in the modern state of Israel. You'll see in this lecture there is, okay, let me just open up with the Zoom. So here it is. Now, what I did was I put together a list of denominations in Judaism. So a lot of people know about these things, but it doesn't occur to them that these are denominations. Because when you read about it in the history, you don't think these are denominations. When people think today about denominations in Judaism, they think we're Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox. When they think again, they'll realize that even within Orthodoxy, there's Hasidic, there's non-Hasidic, there's modern Orthodox. I mean, there are some, in Israel, there are even more. But their denominations did exist in the past. What is unique about Judaism is that they all disappeared. Even denominations that were very strong disappeared, which is an interesting question, why this happened and how it happened. Okay, so if you look in what I sent you, the first one, I call a denomination that existed for one day. What do I mean by denomination? The sin of the golden calf. Book of Exodus, we're going to be reading it this coming Shabbat. Parashat Ki Tisa. What was the sin of the golden calf? This is explained by Judah Halevi in his book Kuzari, written in Spain in the 11th century. In this book Kuzari, where he's discussing Judaism, he has this dialogue with the king of the Khazars. You know, there's a story about the Khazar kingdom that lived in the steppes of Russia, today the area of, what do you call it again? Kafkaz, the area of the Kafkaz. And there was a kingdom there that took upon themselves Judaism. They existed somewhere from about 740 till about 970, and then the kingdom was destroyed, I think, by Genghis Khan or something. They were just destroyed. There are political reasons why they took upon themselves Judaism, because they were a buffer between the Byzantine Empire and the Muslim Empire. So it was good to be something else. But it actually did exist. If you go to, for instance, Vilnius, outside of Vilnius, there is a small town called Trakai, where there is a castle. And the people who used to defend the castle were Khazars, who were also Karaites. So one of the thinking is that the Khazars they followed a more biblical Judaism than a rabbinic Judaism, because they, you know, and the interesting thing is Khazar Karaites, who were the guards for this palace, they have prayer books which are written in the Turkish dialect, because that was what the Khazars spoke. They spoke a Turkish dialect. By the way, in the museums in the Ukraine, in Kiev, they have museums of these Khazars. There are tombstones written in Hebrew and Turkish about names of people. It's an interesting chapter that we know very little about. And you have these museums, but they're not open to the public. You have to make a special request to see them. But it looks like Kiev was founded by Khazars, the city of Kiev. Okay, getting back to this. In antiquity, Jews always believed that there was one God. But there were two things in antiquity that non-Jews didn't understand about us in the pagan world. Number one, okay, you believe in one God, but why do you believe that there's only one God? Okay, what's this exclusivity and intolerance? Right? Paganism is very tolerant. Hindus believe in 33 million gods. So what does it matter if there's another one? So it's interesting that in India, people are very tolerant when it comes to that. India, by the way, they like Israelis. You know, the story about this fellow goes to India from Israel and he's traveling around. And this fellow says, wow, how many Israelis are there? He says, well, this was at the time, about 6 million. I said, I didn't ask you in India. I want to know in Israel how many there are. You know, India has like what 1.4 billion people or something. No, a billion people, but they're going to surpass China soon. Because China, the population is going down, and India is still going up. So assume they're going to surpass. But anyhow, two things that in antiquity they didn't understand. Why do Jews say that there's only one God? What's this intolerance? And the second thing is that in general in paganism, and you had this argument in Christianity too, are you allowed to worship God through an icon? Right? This was an argument between the Orthodox and the Catholics. So Judaism, of course, doesn't believe in any pictures. As it says in the book of Devarim, in Deuteronomy, Ki lo ritem kol tmuna, you did not see any picture when you were at Sinai. But people like pictures, right? Officially, the Orthodox Church is against icons, but as you know, everybody's got their pictures. So there must be a human inclination towards this. So the Jews who came out of Egypt, who lived in the Egyptian culture, and the Egyptian culture had about 33 gods and lots of pictures and icons. So they didn't understand. There was Moses. He was the man of God. So he was our conduit, our intermediary between us and God, right? Now he's been gone. He said he would be back in 40 days. It's already 40 days. Now what do? How do we talk to God if there's nothing in between? Because in idolatry, what is idolatry? They don't actually think that the piece of wood is God, but they think that it's a technique to talk to God or to talk to angels or something. It's a conduit. It's a technique. On your computer, you don't think those icons mean anything, but if you hit the icon, right, that can bring you to something. That's exactly what the pagan world thought. But if there's nothing, what do? You know, when the Romans destroyed the Second Temple, they said they walked into the Holy of Holies, because in the Second Temple, there was no ark in the Holy of Holies. They walked into the Holy of Holies and saw nothing and were in shock.
Mm-hmm.
How could you see nothing? This is supposed to be the holiest part. They were expecting to see some icon, and there was nothing there. So Jews coming out of Egypt after living there for 210 years, when you had people, now the question is, who started this? Okay, so some of the commentaries say it must have been the mixed multitude who came out. But it could have been Jews too. But the point is, it obviously was not a lot of people, because when Moses says to the Levites to kill everybody who was involved in the golden calf, it was 3,000 people. But we know from the book of Deuteronomy, there were 600,000 men from the ages of 20 and 60, and there were also women and children. So there were probably 1.5 million people. The very fact there was only 3,000 means that everybody else just watched. Now, there was maybe yes, maybe no. They were interested in seeing if it would work. or not. So this, I call this a one-day denomination, because they thought that maybe icons could be away, but that would stop that same day. So let me continue. That was just an idea. I call that a denomination of an idea, because it didn't even last for more than a day. In the first temple, we find our first denomination. How did it happen? In the book of Deuteronomy, it says that you're supposed to bring the offerings to God in the place that God will choose. From Makoma Sheyivchar Hashem, the place that God will choose. It says a few times, but it doesn't say where. It's only when Samuel the prophet appointed David as the first king after Saul, and David wanted to build the temple, that Samuel told him where it's going to be, in Jerusalem. But God said to David, unfortunately, you cannot build the temple because your hands are full of blood. Your son will build the temple, Solomon. And Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem. Because it says in Deuteronomy that you have to bring all of your offerings to the place that God shall choose, from the moment the temple is built in Jerusalem, all the local altars that existed up and down the country were invalid. This is also mentioned in Jewish law, but it's based on the verse in Deuteronomy that when God chooses that spot, that's where you're going to bring all your sacrifices. But socially, people didn't understand it. Let's say somebody lived on Mount Carmel, like Elijah, the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel. Somebody lived in Mount Carmel, today is the city of Haifa. And they lived there before the temple was built by Solomon. So there was a local altar in their area. And they would say, you know, my grandfather was the chief rabbi of the city. He used to bring offerings on this altar to God, and you're telling me I'm not allowed to do it anymore? People didn't get it. How is that possible? In the book of Kings, if you read the book of Kings 2, it keeps saying, but the altars were not removed. Kings were afraid to remove the altars, even kings of Judah, because the people wanted the altars. This was my father's and my grandfather's, and we donated to it, and we built something around it. We donated the benches, and we did this, man. You're telling me we have to take it down? No way. Who are you? Okay, it took generations. So the altars, people actually thought it was okay, but the Bible keeps condemning it generation after generation until all the way to the destruction of the temple condemns the altar. I call them a denomination, but in Hebrew it's called bamot, which is an altar, but it's an understandable mistake. Let me put it that way. But sometimes people have to realize it's a mistake. But it's an understandable mistake, but the Bible does not excuse it. And many of the kings were afraid to take them down because, you know, kings need the support of the people. And they didn't take them down. It's like, okay, I won't go there. They'll go there. Something like that. So that's the bamot. That happens around approximately around the year 950 during the reign of Solomon. That disappears with the destruction of the first temple. Officially, the bamot are gone, but also the temple is gone. When the second temple is built in Jerusalem, after King Cyrus gives the decree that's mentioned in the book of Ezra in the Bible, it's also at the end of Chronicles 2. So Cyrus says to the Jews they can go up back to the land. He even offers them to take back the vessels from the first temple, the golden vessels, and to reinstate them in the temple. And I just want to make sure I'm still. Yes, I'm still recording, right? Good. So the Jews go back, so they do build the temple, but then they have to stop in the middle. There's all these groups who tattletale and say, no, the Jews, they will turn against you, they're disloyal. And under Darius the first, they stopped the building of the temple, and then they started it again after that. But anyhow, the temple eventually is built. And there are no altars. However, by the way, there were Jews living in Alexandria at that time. Because when Jeremiah left Israel together with the people after the assassination of Gedaliah, which is mentioned in the book of Jeremiah, he went down to Egypt because there was a Jewish community that was formed in Egypt after the destruction of the first temple. So not only did you have Jews in Babylonia, there are Jews in Alexandria. We know that in the second temple period, towards the end of the second temple period, during the time of Onias, Chonio built a temple in Alexandria. Today we would call it a synagogue, but in those days they didn't have the concept of a synagogue. Now, officially, it's possible that they even brought offerings. It could be that they even brought offerings of the temple of Onias, which would not be allowed according to Jewish law. But so I assume that most of the time the temple of Onias was like a synagogue, but it looks like they also brought offerings there, which is interesting. It's almost like a sort of local denomination which happens in Egypt at the time. That stops, of course, with the destruction of the Alexandrian community in the year in the year 115, when there is a rebellion of the various minorities against the Roman Empire, and then the Jewish community really falls apart in the year 150. I told them to bring diet, but that's, I guess, what they did. Okay. So therefore, I mentioned, so in the early part, in the first temple, you have the Bamot, the local altars. With the destruction of the temple, that basically disappears. Even what happens in the temple of Onias, Chonio, in the second temple period, it seems like a more local event, which also disappears eventually. When Alexandrian Jewish community starts to disintegrate, that was the end of that. Nobody attempts to make another temple outside of Jerusalem anymore. The next group, we know for sure were denominations, because we're told this by Josephus Flavius. He mentions it both in his Antiquities and also in his the Jewish Wars. And Josephus tells us there were three groups that lived in Jerusalem: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. The Sadducees were all priests, Kohanim. They also ran the temple. They were the aristocracy, and they also ran the government. So at that time, Jerusalem was a theocracy. Theocracy, meaning the ones who are the religious appointees are also running the government, which were the Kohanim. By Jewish law, by the way, Kohanim are not supposed to run the government. It has to be from the tribe of Judah, and specifically from the house of David. The king is supposed to be a descendant of David. That's why in the book of Hosea, it says, and they shall look for, and they shall search for the Lord their God and David their king. What does it mean, David their king? Somebody descended from David. All the kings of Judah were descended from David. And eventually, in the reinstatement of the third temple, it has to be, the king has to be from Judah. Now, today it's actually relatively easy, because almost every Jew is from the tribe of Judah today, if they're not a Levi or a Kohen. However, this also has to be from the Davidic descent. The royal blue blood in Judaism is King David. So that's why we also say that the Messiah will be from King David. Because what is Messiah? In Hebrew, Mashiach means anointed. By the way, it means the same in Greek. Christos is anointed. Who is anointed? The king. The Kohanim were also anointed, the priests and the Levites, but that was just at the beginning. But every new king is anointed by oil. So, and the kings have to be the kings of David. So, so the the Sadducees already did a bit of a no-no by taking over Jerusalem as kings. By the way, the first king, or the first, I would say, political leader, because nobody called him king, at the beginning of the Second Temple period was Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel. He's mentioned not only by Josephus and Antiquities, but also in the book of Ezra. Zerubbabel, together with Ezra and Nehemiah, they come to Israel, and Zerubbabel is the political leader. Zerubbabel is a descendant from King David. So they took this very seriously. However, by the time of Nehemiah already, he doesn't seem to be in the picture anymore. The Talmud says that in the first half of the Second Temple period, there was a court called the Men of the Great Assembly, Anshe Knesset Hagadolah, the Men of the Great Assembly. It's not mentioned in the Bible, which means that it probably did not exist in the biblical period. When I say the biblical period, I mean in the narrative of the biblical period. The narrative of the biblical period really stops with Nehemiah and the three last prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So they're not in that, but according to the Talmud, they were actually the editors of the Bible. And according to the Talmud, the Men of the Great Assembly, the last one of them was Shimon ben Shetach, Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Just, who lives around 250 before the Common Era. That was the end of the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, the Men of the Great Assembly, but 120 members. Which, by the way, the Knesset in Israel has 120 members, and they call themselves Knesset, like Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, the Men of the Great Assembly. I always say the reason is because the Men of the Great Assembly, they claim, had three prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, and all our politicians talk as if they're prophets. You know what's going to happen if you do this? They all talk like prophets, right? So, and some of them are in for the prophet. So, getting back to this. So the Sadducees, who are the Sadducees and why were they called Sadducees, by the way? In the book of Ezekiel, we actually read it in this last week's Pericopa, because we always read something from the prophets. So Ezekiel praises the house of Tzadok as being a great priestly line. Because Ezekiel praised the house of Tzadok, all the priests like saying, we're from the house of Tzadok. You know, the one that Ezekiel mentions, that's us. So all of a sudden, all the priests call themselves Tzukim. Tzukim in Hebrew, Sadducees, meaning we're from the house of Tzadok, that famous line. Yeah. The fact that some people pay to get into the priesthood, they don't mention that. But I'm just saying, it's understandable why all the priests call themselves Sadducees, because we're all from this house of Tzadok, just anybody. So that was the Sadducees. The Pharisees, Prushim, literally Prushim means those who separated themselves, I guess, from things which were impure, things which were regular, and wanted to be involved in holiness. That's what Parush means in Hebrew, to separate yourself. But the Prushim actually were the rabbinic scholars. Interestingly enough, some of the Prushim were actually Kohanim, were actually priests. The reason for this, let me explain. The Bible sees priests as teachers, which makes a lot of sense, because in agricultural society, the main job is to toil the land. And that takes a lot of time. But Kohanim didn't have land. They had cities but no land. So they had to be supported by the people. That was what was called the truma, the donations. That was the maaser, the tithe. This went to the Kohanim or went to the Levites because they had no property. And this was on purpose. You work in the temple, but you don't know property. You have to decide. Well, you don't decide. That's what the Bible decided for you. So remember, not all the Kohanim worked in the temple at the same time because there were too many of them. They were split into 24 groups. Every group worked 2 weeks a year in the temple. That's the way they did it. So what did they do the rest of the time? They were teachers. It was the ministry of education. The Kohanim were the teachers. How do we know this? Well, first of all, the book of Deuteronomy. When Moses blesses the tribe of Levi, in the last chapters of the book of Deuteronomy, he says about the Levi, Um, Yoru mishpatecha liYaakov v'toratcha liYisrael, which means they shall teach your precepts to Jacob and your Torah to Israel. And they also bring fragrance on the altar, and they play music in the temple. So Moses says specifically, even before this happens, because Moses was not in the land, they're going to be the teachers, because they're not going to have land. So obviously, they have the time, they'll be the teachers. They know the law. We also know this from the book of Zechariah. Zechariah also says, Ki siftei kohen yishmeru dat, because the lips of the kohen, the lips of the priest, will keep knowledge, and Torah will be studied from him because he is like an angel of God. So we know from Zechariah, who actually saw the second temple, that the Kohanim were the teachers. So it's sort of understandable. They're already in a position of teachers. So it makes sense that they would be the rabbis. So even though the Pharisees and the Sadducees didn't see eye to eye, some of the Pharisees were Kohanim, because the Pharisees believed in the study of Torah as being the element of leadership. And we know when we look in the history of the early years of the Sanhedrin, all the early years of the Sanhedrin, the heads of the high court, which is called Sanhedrin, which is mentioned by that name also in the New Testament, were actually Kohanim. All the early presidents of the Sanhedrin, until Hillel, were all Kohanim. They were all priests. Because this idea that a Kohen is a learned person, eventually that switches, and rabbis don't have to be priests anymore. And with the destruction of the temple, it totally switches, because nobody has land anymore. So there's no specific reason why it has to be the priest by that point. So the Pharisees, Josephus says that the people were behind the Pharisees, but the Sadducees controlled the power. They had the political power, and they controlled the temple. Where the Essenes, by the way, were closer to the Pharisees, but they were more ascetic in their way of life, at least what we have from the scrolls of the Dead Sea Scrolls. With the destruction of the temple, since the power of the Sadducees came from the temple, they lost everything. And only the Pharisees continued. So they basically disappeared from history. With the destruction of the second temple, there are no more Sadducees. They're just gone. Even the arguments between them, the Sadducees wanted more the emphasis to be on the written Bible, not so much on the oral tradition. Just all disappeared. The Sadducees, according to what we know, didn't believe in the world to come, because it doesn't say what?
They lost their jobs because the temple was not.
They lost their influence. It's not clear how strong their influence was in the beginning, because as I said, Josephus claims that the people followed the Pharisees. But definitely with the destruction of the temple, they had nothing to show anymore, and they just disappeared. Okay, let's go to the next one. In the late Second Temple period, of course, we have another famous Jewish denomination, which is Christianity.
About these three denominations on
Yes.
second period, and what the thing that Josephus Flavius is writing about. He mentions also, I think that in antiquities, the Zealots and Sicarists, they are also denominations or just groups, how we consider them?
The Zealots and the Sicarim are mentioned during the war against the Romans. So that's really right at the end. It's more a reaction to Rome. I mean, the Zealots wanted to fight to the end, whereas the rabbis didn't want to. And, there's a story of Yochanan ben Zakkai.
It's a confusion because he speaks about them along with the other three groups.
Yeah, but at least according to the Talmud, which could be just a different narrative, the Talmud claims that the rabbis were not happy with the idea. Remember, Jeremiah also told the people not to fight the Babylonians. And the rabbis at the end of the Second Temple period, when they saw the end was coming, they didn't want to fight the Romans. They didn't see the point. And there's a famous story told in the Talmud in Tractate of Gittin about Yochanan ben Zakkai. Yochanan ben Zakkai was one of the leading rabbis during the rebellion. And his brother-in-law was the head of the Zealots. His name was Abba Sikra. Right? And Abba Chilkia, or Abba Sikra, he was Abba Chilkia. So he has a meeting with his brother-in-law. And he says to him, look, this is not going to end well. So I want to talk to the Romans. Abba Chilkia says, look, I can't help you, but do whatever you think you have to do. But then Yochanan says, but Yochanan says, well, the problem is I can't get out of the city because your men are standing at all the gates. He says, I'll tell you what to do, but you didn't hear it from me. Okay. He says, what should I do? He says, tell your students that you're sick. You're not feeling well. And then after a couple of weeks, they'll say that you died. We bury people out of the city because we're not allowed to bury them in Jerusalem according to Jewish law. And then do what you ever think you have to do. So that's what he did. He told the one of two students what the plan was, and that was it. And they told everybody that he's not feeling well. And then after a couple of weeks, they said he's on his deathbed and that he died. So they put him into a coffin and they started carrying him out of the city. When he came to the gates of the city, so you had zealots were standing at the gates. They said, what do you got here? What do we got? You can't see what we have. It's a coffin. We're burying Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. We want to just put a sword in just in case. Is that okay? So you're going to put a sword into the chief rabbi's coffin. I think that's a little bit too much, right? Can we just shake it a little bit? No, we don't think that's proper either. They didn't want that to happen, the Talmud says, because a live person weighs less than a dead person. So they didn't, and they let them through. The story continues that Yochanan ben Zakkai comes to the other side, sees the Roman camp, runs towards the Roman camp, and right away soldiers stop him. What do you want? He says, I need to speak to the general who's in charge here. That was Titus. Or was it Vespasian? I think it was Vespasian. He says, I need to speak to the general. So they bring him in, and he says, hello, my king. Vespasian says, hello, my king. I am not the Caesar. I could have you arrested for that. Yochanan ben Zakkai says to him, you must be the king. Because it says in the Bible, Halavanon, that Lebanon, which is a connotation for Jerusalem, Ba'adir Tipo will fall in the hands of the mighty. And who is the mightiest if not the king of Rome? Caesar. So you obviously must be a Caesar. Says, if you think I'm a Caesar, why didn't you come to me before? Says, well, I couldn't get out of the city because the zealots wouldn't. As they're having this discussion, a messenger comes from Rome. Says to Vespasian, Caesar just died. They elected you to be the next head of the Senate. Vespasian, this is the Talmud story. Vespasian is in shock. He looks at Ben Zakkai. He says, okay, this is a good day. And obviously you know something that I don't. What did you want? Just tell me, I'll give it to you. He says, I have 3 requests. Number 1, I want to create a place in the town of Yavne for the scholars after you take over Jerusalem, because I want to continue with our learned scholars. You have scholars too. We have scholars too. We will need that after. Says, okay, granted. What else? Says, I want the head priest of the temple. His name is Rabbi Tzadok. I want him to be with us. Okay, what else? Says, I want the Gamliel family. That was the family from Hillel. Because they are top scholars, I need them too. Says, fine. That's it. And eventually, after the destruction of the temple, all the scholars are brought to Yavne and they rebuild the Sanhedrin. What becomes the Sanhedrin? Start as the Sanhedrin continues through Yochanan ben Zakkai. This story is related to us through Rabbi Akiba, who lives 100 years later. No, 60 years later. And Akiba, when he's telling this story, he quotes a verse that sometimes even wise men become stupid. And he says, how come he didn't ask for Jerusalem? You know what? He probably knew that that was the one question that would have been no. There's no way the Romans would have stood there for 3 years and just given up Jerusalem just like that because some guy who's smiling and gave some good news. That wouldn't have happened. But there's another interesting story told in the Talmud in Bracha, in chapter 4, about Yochanan ben Zakkai. Same guy. It says on his deathbed, his students came to him and said, teach us something that we can live a good life. And he tells them a few things. And then he says, I think my end is near. So remove the vessels now from the room so that it won't become impure by the dead body. And then he says to his students, I don't know which way I'm going. There are 2 paths in front of me. One of them is to heaven. One of them is to hell, which we call Gehinnom in Hebrew. I don't know which way I'm going, so I'm really nervous. And then at the end, when he actually dies, he says, bring a chair for King David. That's it. I'll tell you what it means. This I heard from Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who was the son of Rabbi Kook. He says, Yochanan ben Zakkai lived the rest of his life uncertain that he made the right decision. He didn't ask for Jerusalem because he thought he wouldn't get it. But it ate him up. What if? What if? So he said to himself at the end, I don't know what path I'm taking. It shows that his whole life after that, he couldn't deal with it. And this idea of set up the throne for King David means David came to greet him. Yeah, I find that a beautiful story. Okay, so let's get back to this. So I'm taking too long on this. We're not getting to where I want to do, but we will. Christianity starts off as a denomination in Judaism. It's actually the only denomination in antiquity which not only continues, but takes a whole different journey, of course, because all the early Christians were Jews. In fact, in the Roman literature, when they talk about Christianity, they see it as an internal fight among Jews. They don't even, that's their business, sort of like. There's an interesting book written by David Flusser. David Flusser was a professor of religion, comparative religion at Hebrew University. He wrote a whole book about the historical Jesus. And what he tried to show, there are a lot of people who argue that Jesus was a bad Jew, he wasn't following Jewish law. He tries to argue that every place in the New Testament which seems to imply that he did something against Jewish law, there was an opinion like that in Jewish law, that he actually did follow Jewish law to the detail. So the big book, you can find it on Amazon if you're interested, David Flusser. But obviously it took its own path, of course, later on.
Isn't he quoted by Julie in Je suis Israël? Isn't he quoted, David Flusser, by Julie in the Je suis Israël?
I don't know because I'm not so familiar with that literature. Yes. I knew his son, I knew him, but I didn't actually.
It wasn't documentation about the historical Jesus and respecting the law. And
yeah, I know, I understand it's an argument. Yeah, I think even between the Orthodox and the Catholics, there's an argument about what exactly happened at the Last Supper, which of course was the Passover Seder. So did he eat unleavened matzah or did he eat leavened matzah? Right? Because on Sunday you have leavened wafers, and the Catholics and the Anglicans have unleavened wafers. So it's also a question of the historical moment of how to understand, which is also interesting. Okay, so I just have to mention that because it doesn't remain a Jewish denomination. From Paul, it's definitely not a Jewish denomination anymore, but it does continue until. Let's continue. In the 9th century, in Babylonia, you have another denomination, and this is called the Karaites. Karaim, from the word Mikra, which means the Bible, scripture, Biblia. The Karaites, which started in the 9th century, a fellow by the name of Anan ben David. Every movement has its politics. And David didn't get along with the exilarch, the chief rabbi of Babylonia. And they created a movement which wanted to go back to the written law without the oral tradition, which was not easy to do by the 9th century because the oral tradition was already written in the year 200. So, and it was finished in around 600, even the Talmud. So it was quite a bold move. The Karaites were quite popular under the Babylonian Empire. I'm talking about Babylonian Empire after the destruction of the Second Temple, even into the Muslim Babylonian Empire, meaning when the Muslims conquered Babylonia, all the way to the 9th and 10th century. We know this from the arguments. Saadia Gaon argues with the Karaites. Abraham Ibn Ezra in the 11th century in his Bible commentary is arguing with the Karaites. Because remember, the Karaites, because they were not interested in the oral tradition, Torah Shebaal Peh, so they spent all their time writing commentary on the Bible. And in the Cairo Geniza, they found a whole bunch of commentaries on the Bible written by Karaites in Arabic. Some of these you can find at the Oxford Bodleian Library in London, in Oxford. And so it's understandable that the Bible commentaries of the 11th, 12th centuries were arguing with Karaites. The Karaites almost disappeared. Today, there may be a few thousand left. You have some in Jerusalem, you have some in the city of Ramla, and that's about it. There was a larger group in Egypt as late as the beginning of the 20th century. Interesting thing about the Karaites who lived in Egypt is that they decided to do marriage and divorce according to Jewish law in order to be able to intermarry with the Jews. Because if they wouldn't do that, they would have to be separate. But other Karaite groups did not act such way. My grandfather, who was born in the Crimea, the city of Simferopol, he said in his city there were Karaites. So you had, right into the 20th century, you had Karaites all over the place. In fact, in the Second World War, the Karaites told the Nazis that they were not Jewish for obvious reasons, right? But as I said, by the end of the war, they're almost gone. And today, they're really very, very few. Okay, let's keep going. That was the 9th century. In the 17th century, you have a messianic movement called Sabbatianism, Shabtai Tzvi. It's not exact, it doesn't start as a denomination as Judaism at all, but it turns into a denomination. After the death of Shabtai Tzvi, it turns into a denomination. It's very strange. That doesn't usually happen that way. Well, but see, Sabbatianism basically was a messianic movement based on the Jewish belief that there's eventually going to be a Messiah, and this fellow said, it's me, okay? And you had enough people. This happened just 1 or 2 years after the Khmelnytsky massacres in the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, where tens of thousands of Jews were slaughtered during this. It's almost like it goes on for almost 3 years. You have the Khmelnytsky massacres, you have the Swedish-Polish War, and Jews were caught in the middle the whole time. So people were looking for some good news. And under the Ottoman Empire, which reaches all the way to Poland, to southern Poland, when, this guy from, where was he from originally? From Izmir, right? Shabtai Tzvi. He was an ascetic type of person. Supposedly he was also good looking, and he was very strict about Jewish law. So the rabbis were impressed, And when he had his meeting with the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, everybody was impressed. Okay, so and then of course the Sultan realized what was going on. He forced him to convert to the Islam, which eventually Shabtai did. And he eventually died in prison. And even after he died, you had people who were so believing in him that the fact that he converted to Islam didn't mean anything. The fact that he died didn't mean anything. For hundreds of years, you have secret Sabbatians who believe. It's not even clear how this happens, because if he's not around, what exactly is supposed to be going on exactly? It's very interesting. Sabbatianism keeps going on at least till the 18th century. By the way, the Hasidic movement in Poland, there was under suspect that it might be Sabbatian, or at least Frankist, which was another Messianic movement. So just to show you how long this continues, it's crazy. So it goes from 1665 till all the way till about 1750, almost like 100 years. The cryptic Sabbatian movement. So it's a small denomination, but it sort of like disappears after that. Okay, in the 18th century, I mentioned you have Frankism, another one of these Messianic movements, which has its own ideas. It also disappears. It wasn't even as long as the Sabbatians. It disappears even before that. In the 18th century, Hasidism. I'm not going to say a lot about Hasidism because you could spend a whole year talking about Hasidism. The Hasidic movement was a popular movement. And as all popular movements, it had a side where it was anti-establishment. The very fact that you're telling the young people, come to our synagogue and not to the synagogue that you grew up in, is already anti-establishment. The fact that they wanted people to do kosher slaughtering in one way and not another way, which means that the other way is no good anymore, that's also income, which the community can't get. The fact that they want to create a certain dress code, that's also creates, identity. But so I'm just saying the Hasidic movement at the beginning, at least the opposition, saw them as a movement which they saw as being a sort of reform movement. They're doing things different than we're doing. And it wasn't clear, theoretically, if you're a very popular movement, it's very possible to give into the whims of the population. The Hasidic movement probably did not go that path because of the opposition. There was such a strong opposition to the Hasidic movement in Lithuania that it sort of kept them within the red lines. And therefore, they probably never went on that path. But at the beginning, there was that possibility that it could have happened. So if the Hasidic movement started off as a denomination, it quickly, within 30 to 50 years, placed itself squarely back in Orthodoxy. But it could have landed up anywhere, theoretically, because when you have a mass movement which attracts hundreds of thousands of people, it's very hard to control. There was Ida Rappaport, passed away a few years ago in London. And so she wrote an article once time, and she said the Hasidic movement wasn't a movement until the opposition, the Mitnagdim, opposed it. Because before, everybody just did their own thing. They never met. They never discussed, the leaders never met. But when there was opposition, they had to meet. So it was the opposition that forged them into a movement. And they had to meet periodically to discuss what should be our next step. Probably the opposition kept them within the fold of Orthodoxy. And today, when you think of Hasidim, you call them ultra-Orthodox. But it wasn't seen that way at the beginning. In the 19th century, that's where we're talking about the denominations that existed today. I don't call Hasidism a denomination anymore because it doesn't see itself that way. It sees itself as just part of Orthodoxy. Shalom, shalom. I'm going to probably finish in 10 minutes anyhow, but thank you. Yes, of course, no problem. So, because this is supposed to be exactly 2 hours, so. Okay. The 19th century, and I'm going to talk about this more tomorrow. It is the 19th century which creates the denominations of Judaism which we are familiar with today, which have been around for about 200 years, some of them less. The Reform movement starts around 1818 in Hamburg, in Germany, the Jewish Reform movement. There are different variations of Jewish Reform. The conservative movement really starts in the United States at the end of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th century, really the beginning of the 20th century. But it has roots also in Germany, in what we call the Wissenschaft des Judentum, the Jewish Scientific Society, which was in Breslau. Reconstructionism is a mid-20th century phenomena in the United States. But so these are the major groups today when you think of the Jewish world as Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. Even though you have inner roads within Orthodoxy, I would say one thing which is common among all Orthodox Jews is that they see the Code of Jewish Law of the 16th century as the defining rule book of Jewish law, with variations, but basically that's the defining rule book. The denominations are really a reaction to the emancipation, which is what I'll talk about tomorrow. But what is the emancipation? The emancipation starts in certain countries almost simultaneously: France, the United States, Germany, England. The emancipation is the idea, maybe influenced by the French Revolution, that people should not be recognized only as minorities, but also as individuals. Right? Before the emancipation, if a Jew lived in the Prussian Empire, they were recognized as a group. So whatever rights the Jews had, you had. If you were a Roma, whatever rights the Roma had, you had, right? If you were living in France and you were Protestant, then whatever rights the Protestants, so people were part of groups. They were not individuals. Nobody had an individual passport. The idea of the emancipation is now you're recognized as an individual. Your group identity is irrelevant to the state. So that is a concept of equality. It means the state really doesn't care. But what it does now, for the first time, it gives the possibility of leaving the fold that you were in, because that possibility didn't exist. Before emancipation, there wasn't the possibility of a secular Jew. Because even if you didn't agree with the Jewish community, if you would move away from them, you wouldn't be recognized by the state. You would be a nobody. So you didn't even have that option. Emancipation gives that option. And therefore, there's a lot of fear and trepidation. What's going to happen after emancipation? And most of the fear was justified. But all that will be tomorrow. Okay, dear friends.